Chapter 41 Part 2 What? Never seen an A-rank goblin hunter before? You might think it is overkill, but I think I'm not enough. Think about it, goblins are hunted worldwide, slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands each year. Tribes big and small are wiped out and exterminated whenever and wherever they are found. And yet, if you step outside a city, any city, chances are you can find a goblin tribe within 20 miles. That probably sounds like a lot to you city folk, but for an adventurer that isn't even a light jog. A D-rank team of adventurers can cover that distance, slaughter a goblin tribe, and be back within a day, so long as there aren't any evolved gobs. The guild actively posts bounties on goblin tribes within 50 miles of a settlement, not to mention a general bounty for their ears wherever they might be taken, and has for the past 3 millennia. 3,000 years of trying to wipe goblins out, and we haven't even been able to get them out of walking distance of the royal capital. Jirok, a rank goblin hunter, having a conversation at a bar 2 days before the beginning of the First Goblin War. It was very strange not to be in the air, but my part in the strategy was even more strange. I had suggested just letting me poison the lot of them, but it turned out that goblins also had the strong stomach racial ability. While I personally didn't see that as too much of a problem so long as I used a toxin that worked on skin contact or something, Rovan said that depending on how effective the poison was they would probably outbreed it. Frankly, that sounded a bit ludicrous to me, but what do I know? With poison off the table, my next thought was to stay in the air and let Ray rain arrows down from above. However, the tree cover meant that it wouldn't be very effective. If I was going to carry Ray into battle I would have to do it from the ground, but I was well aware that I was not exactly built for ground combat. Wyverns, myself included, with our powerful bodies and legs have clearly evolved. Wait, how does Darwinian evolution work in a world like this? Does it work? I think I will just ignore that thought. To dive down onto prey from above and land directly on them. The weight of the wyvern's body slamming into and stunning larger prey while rending them with their large claws before bringing the jaws into play. A wyvern on the ground has difficulty bringing its claws into play and certainly can't make the most of its strength and mass. Rovan's plan for me essentially split the difference between being in the air and being on the ground. After such a long time, I will be going back to toad roots and hopping. He wants me to combine my jumping and flying to make long, high jumps as a way to pounce on my opponents while helping Ray reposition. I was less than enthused about the idea, but I wasn't about to argue over it. Rovan, Tamling, and Colin were going to attract the goblins' attention and tempt them into swarming them. Ilma would be hanging back, although within reach of Carlin, to fry them as they grouped up. Ray and I, meanwhile, would serve to disrupt any attempt at organization. Attacking hobs and redcaps that tried to command the lesser gobs. Her arrows and my flight would allow us to strike anywhere on the small battlefield, and although a full-grown hob would be stronger than me right now, together with Ray, and my toxins, there shouldn't be any problems. Well, aside from the fact that you almost certainly are going to get it, Rovan admitted with a grimace. I could understand if you didn't want to do this, especially if the gobs have real weapons. She doesn't think they can really hurt her all that much, Ray translated my attempt at speech. So long as she isn't stuck in a fight alone, she is confident that she is tough enough to handle even hobs given how you have described them. Rovan frowned at that. You shouldn't underestimate hobs. Admittedly, Ray didn't see any, and redcaps are generally not as focused on brute strength, but hobs can have upwards of 300 strength. Sure, but unless they have some kind of poison resistance and a way to actually stop me from flying away, it doesn't really matter unless they can kill me in a single hit. Given my racial abilities and stats, I am confident that 300 strength would not be enough to kill me instantly unless my enemy was very lucky. Still, I decided to let the point drop. Making Ray translate my arguments seemed rude, and why am I arguing that I can handle even more dangerous positions anyway? Probably because moving along the ground made me nervous in general. My instincts are frustrating like that, but they're easier to handle in a group like this. Ray's calm through the bond is incredibly helpful for maintaining my composure as we hike through the forest. We run into far less monsters than I thought we would. Apparently my valley had a higher than normal monster density because it was an ideal place for many monsters to spawn, and it also kept that spawn in a relatively small location. And of course, the local goblin tribe was also hunting the local monsters for food and experience. As a result, our hike was quick and quiet, allowing us to reach the goblin encampment relatively quickly. Calling it an encampment seemed a bit wrong though. Den, maybe. No, that has too much of a cozy connotation. Perhaps nest would be a better word, because goblin construction was more of a messy nest than it was anything that I would call an encampment. A generous woman might call their piles of sticks and hides crude lean-tos, but at least for this life I am a wyvern, so I am calling it them nest like piles of junk. Rotting junk, because they haven't treated the hide to make it leather. They hadn't even removed all the bits of meat. For once, I was happy to have low stats. What I could smell just now was already bad. I do not want to know what it was like for my teammates with higher perception. According to Ray, the Redcaps had claimed a cave, well, more of an indent in the side of the hill, towards the back of the camp. This was good luck, because without a more evolved goblin around to keep the lesser ones in line, they hadn't even bothered to set a watch. We could have walked right into the camp, but Ravan had a better idea. Ilma, would you mind letting them know we are here? With pleasure, Captain. Her smile was downright evil as fire leapt from her hands. Fwoom! A fireball landed among the lounging goblins, many of which died immediately and many more of which were injured or stunned. Screams of pain and anger sounded out, and soon every single one of the goblins were screeching and scrambling to their feet, looking for something to attack. Ravan provided them a target. He charged forward, activating multiple abilities at once, and literally running over multiple goblins before crashing into the mass of them with a roar. He blew the mob of them apart, sending the gobs that weren't crushed flying with the strength of his charge. I thought that they might break right then and run away, but a screech from the back of them seemed to put some spine into them, and they tried to mob Ravan, only to run into Carlin's blade and Tamling's spear. More were incinerated by Ilma, who strode in behind the three warriors. Another screeching order came from inside the mass, and I felt a surge from Ray through the bond. I launched myself into the air, rising above the battle near instantly. I had no idea where I was supposed to land, but I had to put my trust in Ray's superior perception and the impressions I got through our bond. Aerokinesis and air magic at the peak of my flying leap threw me down to the ground, talons extended as I landed on empty dirt. The redcap I would have crushed beneath me had blinked out of the way and was now in front of me. I lunged forward with envenomed bite, and the redcap's eyes widened and glanced to the side. Redcap's need line of sight to blink, and while it was able to dodge my bite, it was not able to dodge the arrow from Ray, who had expected the teleport. What neither she, nor I, expected was for the redcap to simply grab another goblin and use it as a shield. The smaller gob took Ray's arrow in the belly, and the redcap simply tossed the screaming creature away before blinking again, this time appearing in the air at Ray's height to try and strike at her. While alarming, it wasn't actually dangerous to us. Taking your feet off the ground when fighting a Gale Wyvern is just like asking to be smacked down, and I immediately used aerokinesis to that effect. The redcap blinked away again, but we had other problems to deal with. The goblins surrounding us had regained their courage with our failure to kill their leader and were beginning to try and swarm me. Unlike Ravan, who was also swarmed by goblins, I didn't have armor. Being bitten by a goblin was like being bitten by a dog. A small dog though, not a big one. You have been bitten weakly. You have lost 2 horsepower. I mean, really, does they deserve exclamation points, system? It is probably going to D. You have defeated a LVL 3 Juvenile Goblin, LVL 4 Scavenger, and earned party XP. That is anyway, my skin is toxic. Our party has the alchemy expertise to whip up an antidote for my poisons, so they all drank it ahead of time, and I am free to go wild with my toxins. Seeing how effective it is, I feel like I could have just done my usual trick of leaving poisoned bait for them, but what do I know? I can see why regular goblins are looked down upon so much. I can sweep the area around me clear just by spinning around in a circle and smacking them with my tail. They're mostly naked too, so the toxin will likely kill all of them as well. You have defeated a LVL 2 Young Goblin, LVL 3 Warrior and earned Party XP. You have defeated a LVL 2 dash. I'll just ignore those for now, although it occurred to me that goblins were probably profitable, in terms of XP, to hunt because they had both a species and a class. More importantly, Ray and I knew where that redcap had run off to. Both of us had Presence, the basic class ability that any hunter would have. In general, it gave us a vague idea of where the thing we were hunting was. Somewhat useful, but not very accurate. However, between the two of us it worked a little differently. Because we both had Presence and could share our feelings across the bond, we were able to narrow down the redcap's location by comparing our senses and focusing on the spots they overlapped. I launched myself into the air again, but not at our target. No, I didn't want to alert it to the fact that we knew where it was until the apex of our jump, when I flared my wings upwards to obscure a vision of Ray, giving her time to twist, draw and fire an arrow at where the redcap was, just barely missing my wing. The arrow took it through the eye. I landed heavily, crushing another goblin beneath my talons, only for something large to slam into my side and bowl me over. Ray was knocked off me and came to her feet in a roll while I turned to face this new threat. A hobgoblin. Meanwhile, I noticed Rovan and the others had also been engaged by the goblin elites. A redcap appeared out of thin air next to Tamling, only to be intercepted by Carlin's blade. It attempted to teleport away, but instead of blinking, it merely flickered and Tamling planted his spear in its gut and nailed it to the ground. Ilma's anti-teleport magic was working. Of course, that distraction cost me as the hob attempted to club me over the head. You have taken a heavy blow. You have lost 10 horsepower. Ow. I tried to bite him, but unlike the regular goblins, the hob had a crude shield which he used to block me, or so he thought. Wyverns have absolutely gigantic mouths compared to the kinds of predators I knew about from Earth. Instead of thinking of them like a puma or a lion, it would be better to think of them like a shark or a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Their wide heads were basically 90% jaws. So when the hobgoblin raised his shield, a small buckler, I just decided to chomp down on the whole thing. I was not, unfortunately, strong enough to break it or large enough to swallow it whole, but I certainly could hold it, and that was all it took for Ray to dart in with her blades. The hob let go of the buckler and tried to block her, but I was so close all I had to do was step forward to throw it off balance and give Ray an opening. The hob's crude armor was not nearly enough to protect it as Ray sliced it up. A single nick would have been enough. I had lent my poison to her weapons, but she didn't take any chances and stabbed it repeatedly. Having been a knife user in a previous life, I can appreciate the technique. Sure, it makes you sound crazy, but the proper way to use a knife is to get in close and stab and stab and stab. You'd think that being that close to your opponent would leave you open, but most people are surprisingly bad at reacting to being stabbed repeatedly and usually fumble their defense. Ray, Hyuga, kill that last redcap. Rovan shouted over the fray, it is directing the others. Saying kill that redcap gives us no idea where the damn thing is, of course. And since redcaps are smart enough to understand speech, it has probably moved after being called out like that anyway. Still, Ray and I moved towards the location Rovan indicated, smashing and biting, cutting and slicing our way through the crowd. In some ways, I felt invincible as we slaughtered our way through the goblins, who just barely were occasionally able to bite or scratch me, but for all that we had killed, the crowd of them had yet to thin. Even Ilma's fire wasn't enough to make a dent in their numbers, it seemed. I caught a glimpse of our target through the crowd, a slightly larger redcap flanked by 2 hobgoblin bodyguards. I could see it shouting and pointing, ordering the goblins about. Rovan had explained that goblins were simultaneously suicidally brave and utterly craven at the same time. They would die for their leaders, generally evolved goblins, but without their leaders they would not even take a fight they would win anyway. So if we killed the redcap and hobs, this tribe would likely break apart and flee. Which, ultimately, was our goal. Because actually killing every goblin was widely considered to be impossible, general practice with goblins was to kill their leaders and scatter the tribe. Most of the ones that ran would be picked off by wild monsters because a lone goblin is a dead goblin. Personally, I had difficulty imagining living in a country that would tolerate any amount of monsters. Were it up to me, I'd have taken armies and scoured the entire world of monsters. Don't get me wrong, I am kind of liking being a badass wyvern, but if I wasn't the massive teeth, toxin, claws and magical death, I would be less happy about the whole thing. Ray vaulted onto my back and we took to the air again. I was kind of getting the hang of this now and was able to snag a hob when I landed. For all that hobs were stronger than regular gobs and that my stats were low, the physics of gravity and sharp claws were still mightier than the numbers of the system. You have defeated the LVL 0 Adult Hobgoblin, LVL 13 Scavenger, LVL 6 Warrior, LVL 2 Bodyguard, and earned party XP. The other hob clubbed me in the head hard in recompense, and I stumbled dazed. Ray ignored the hob for now and tried to shoot the redcap before Ilma's spell wore off. This redcap was better than the other one though, and while the arrow hit, it took the blow in its shoulder instead of through its throat. Meanwhile, I was still trying to get my bearings as the hobgoblin advanced. A blast of compressed magical air pushed it back slightly, but it had both feet planted and was able to resist. My aerokinesis could stand to be stronger, I think. The only reason I was able to knock the turtle tentacles away was because it tussled with Thunderbird beforehand. I tried to move forward and bite this hob, but it was smarter than the other one, merely taking a step back and to the side while swinging its club at my head again. You have taken a heavy blow. You have lost 20 horsepower. Why do they keep hitting me in the head? Oh, yeah, because I have to put my head out to bite them. The redcap was advancing, it had an actual sword, and I was too unsteady to allow Ray to aim properly, so she jumped down. I could feel her worry through the bond, but I sent reassurance through it. If she left to fight the redcap, I would take the hob. She did, and I got my feet back under me as I faced my foe again. This hob really was different from the others. Even the first redcap hadn't fought with any technical skill, it had just taken advantage of its bullshit racial ability. This hob, on the other hand, was in a fighting stance. It seemed to know how to fight properly. It had higher stats, equipment, including armor, and knew how to fight while I hit toxins, some magic, sharp teeth and claws, as well as the ability to fly. My best bet would be to try to poison it and run, but given that it wore clothes and armor, that wouldn't be so easy. My best bet would be to not fight this enemy at all, but if I did that, it would join the redcap fighting Ray. No, I had to fight, and I would have to fight this battle straight up, but I had one last advantage. Sure, this hobgoblin knew how to fight, but so did I as a battle mate. I had been trained to fight, whereas this hob would have had to learn from observation. It wasn't just facing some wild wyvern, it was facing me. And I had killed far better warriors than this. I spun, bringing my tail to bear. The hobgoblin dodged and then moved forward to take advantage of the opening, only to be caught by my suddenly extended wing. Aerokinesis brought the off-balance monster to the ground and I pounced. It struggled underneath my claws as I tried to bite it, eventually using its great strength to throw me off, but as far as I was concerned, I had already won. Cuts from my claws could be seen through tears in its clothes, leaking blood where the armor had failed to protect it. Except, it didn't fall. No, it was still standing and watching me warily, but it was shaking now. Apparently my toxin was not enough to kill it, at least not yet. It advanced again, cautiously, and I decided to jump into the fight talons first. It rolled out of the way, striking me painfully but not strongly, but I had expected this. I used aerokinesis to blow myself off my feet, knocking me into the hob. It could have hurt me very badly, perhaps kill me, when I did that, but I knew it wouldn't. This hobgoblin was smarter than the others, but intelligence could be a weakness in battle. It had evolved from a goblin and knew what it was like to be stupid. It knew that it was better to fight smarter, but it had yet to learn how to control the more complex emotions that went along with that. The average goblin wouldn't really be smart enough to understand that my poison would eventually kill it if it kept fighting me. Oh sure, your average goblin could figure it out in a non-combat situation, but figuring that out in the middle of a fight was a bridge too far. This hob, on the other hand, was aware of the danger. It was too aware. It was afraid of being poisoned more. It was afraid of death. And I was not. In its haste to get away, I was able to bite down on its arm and push my venom into its blood. It screamed in agony and tried to force me to release it, but it was getting weaker and I wasn't about to let it go. In fact, I took it with me as I spread my wings and took off. It had dropped its weapon, so it was trying to claw at me with its own free hand as we rose into the sky. I took damage, but not enough for me to stop. It was too ineffective in its panic. It hadn't realized that we had gotten too high for realizing it to be a good thing. I, on the other hand, did and decided to finally oblige the hob and let go. Poisoned and bleeding, it dropped 60 feet to the ground. You have defeated a LVL 14 Adult Hobgoblin, LVL 19 Warleader, LVL 15 Barbarian, LVL 12 Raider, LVL 4 Skirmisher, and earn party XP. In a way, I have to feel sorry for that hob. With better equipment and a modicum of training, it could have beaten me without trouble. If I had known it was that strong, she probably would never have let me fight it alone, but it probably couldn't even use its full strength without breaking its weapon. Plus, while the lesser goblins threw themselves at me without a care, it treated me far more carefully because it recognized me as a dangerous type of monster. However, it didn't know that I was actually weaker than it was. It didn't need to dance around and try to avoid me. It could have just waded in and beat me to death. Ray was far more better matched with her opponent. No, she was better than the redcap and was ending the fight now. I flew down to her side as the goblins backed away. It took a little while longer for the rank-and-file goblins to notice, but soon they were fleeing into the trees, leaving behind piles of their dead. That hobgoblin was actually quite strong, I noted to Ray. I was surprised by it. I saw the notification. She smiled at me, patting my head. I am amazed that you were able to fight a hob like that, let alone kill it. It is incredibly rare to see one like that, and incredibly worrying. I couldn't really see why. I mean, isn't one of the basic monster strategies to have a lot of offspring and let the best rise to the top? Given how numerous goblins are supposed to be, I would expect that even rare exceptions would appear often. Not my problem either way, hopefully. We cleaned the area, in the sense that we executed any wounded or pretending to be dead goblin, recovered as much of the raided goods as we were able to find, and put out Ilma's fires, which she could do pretty easily, so we didn't have to worry about a forest fire, and set off back to Evergold. There, we would be questioned regarding the recovered goods, myself included. Considering that bars of gold were part of what we recovered, I can see why they would be careful with that questioning and use magic to confirm. It was a tiny bit tempting, but gold was useless if you couldn't spend it, and what I wanted to purchase was from the Adventurers Guild itself, information about wyvern evolutions. The guild didn't give out information for free, unless it was directly related to a request above a certain level of danger or value, but you could purchase information on monsters from them. To an adventurer, it was useful information that might save their lives. To a monster like me, it literally was my life. Although I thought that withholding for payment what I viewed as critical information from adventurers was probably bad for the sapient and human races of this world overall, the information was not expensive. I just wouldn't have any money until I got my share of the reward for this request. On the way back to Evergold, I did ask Ravan, through Ray, about the hobgoblin, because with how things generally worked out for me, I presumed it would become my problem regardless of what I hoped. The answer I got was surprising though. Well, I have to correct you a bit first. Ravan began as we hiked, or everyone besides Ray and Ilma hiked. I was carrying them because I thought it was hilarious when Ilma told Tamling that only plebs had to walk. They would have to get off soon, I was too tired to carry them for long, but it was worth it for the laugh. Turning my attention back to Rovan, he began to explain a bit about the hob I fought. War Leader sounds like an intimidating class, but it really isn't great. Rovan began, same with Barbarian. The images that pop into your head when you think of that are, wait, how do you know what a barbarian is? Whatever, the point is that the hobgoblin probably wasn't as strong as you were imagining it to be. War Leader is a combination of warrior, leader, and tribes member, and it is an okay class, but it really isn't great. And Barbarian is actually a lot like commoner or tribes member, just a basic class that some groups of sapients and humans can have. It might have broken 300 strength, but I doubt it would have gone much over 200 in most others. That seems plenty strong to me. Over 3 times stronger as a human? Plus twice as fast, durable, and perceptive? Of course, the average here would be higher. Even someone who is merely a commoner would have at least some stat benefits from their levels, but I suspect 20 points here or there wouldn't make much of a difference. But I do get what Rovan means by that, because when he was talking about the classes he was talking about more than just stats. Pure stats don't make up for abilities unless the difference is massive, and I have 3 defensive abilities that improve my hide. It would be different if the hob was armed with better weapons. A bat'lix might have allowed it to kill me in a single blow, but bludgeoning me to death was simply not easy to do. What Ray was worried about? Rovan seemed to think for a second and then shook his head. Nah, I just can't see a goblin swarm happening here, not with just that. The area around Evergold is too wild, and that mass of goblins would attract a monster that they weren't capable of dealing with. Like the Thunderbird. Why did you think that hob might be a sign of a goblin swarm? I asked Ray, and what exactly is a goblin swarm? It is exactly what it sounds like, but no amount of imagination can really compare to seeing one. It was Tamling who answered. I was surprised he was able to understand me. However, I didn't interrupt him because he was very grim and serious about this topic. Everyone knows that goblins breed. They breed like crazy, but they usually die just as fast to monsters or adventurers or just your average guards. It might sound obvious, but more goblins means more goblins breeding, which means more goblins, so if goblin numbers aren't kept low they can eventually explode out of control. Goblins are true omnivores. It's a racial ability. They can eat very nearly anything and everything, but when they hit the tipping point and their population climbs there isn't even enough dirt to keep them all full. So they go looking for more. Spreading out and breeding out of control, they can scour a land down to the bedrock if given time. Just an unending wave of green that eats everything in its path and doesn't even leave bones behind. Carlin put his hand on Tamling's shoulder and the kid nearly jumped out of his skin. There was a story there, but I knew better than to pry. It was a story that I didn't need to be told to be able to guess what it was about. The rest of the group changed the subject while Ray filled me in, quietly, why stronger hobs could be a sign of a goblin swarm. Goblin swarms happened when goblins begin to suppress the monsters around them. When that happened, more goblins lived, which meant more goblins leveled. So a high-level hobgoblin, especially in a tribe that had multiple evolved goblins, could be a sign that too many goblins were surviving too long. However, Rovan had a very good point. There were monsters here that wouldn't give a damn about numbers and could turn almost any amount of goblins into a buffet. I can't imagine any amount of goblins bothering that turtle, for example. Plus, even if there was a swarm, Ivano would just wave a hand at it and it would go away, along with everything in that general direction. The next day Dancing has leveled up. Dancing is now level 3. Yes, I'll admit I was dancing in place with excitement. How could I not? I had purchased, or Ray had purchased for me, using my money, information on wyvern evolutions. Ray and I had simply walked down to the guild and bought it. I had not honestly expected them to hand it over. I sure wouldn't have done so if I had to decide whether or not to give the flying magic shark information on how to become an even more deadly flying magic shark. Perhaps it was because it was printed with magic into a packet, And the guild receptionist was well aware that I didn't have the ability to turn the pages. Ray had to do it for me. Well, Ilma was doing it now actually. Ray, Ilma, and Tamling had all been interested in my future evolutions, although I think Tamling was mostly interested because Ray was. Wow, there are a lot of evolutions, he was saying with a whistle. Wyverns are considered one of the most adaptable monster species that exist, Ilma noted as she scanned each page quickly before turning it. They can live just about anywhere and their eggs are easily affected by high mana concentration, although I do have to agree, this is a lot more than I expected as well. It had cost me a lot more than it would have if I had asked about another species because the guild had to print multiple pages, and magic printing in this world was not nearly as convenient as the scientific one was. Volcano wyvern, lava wyvern, magma wyvern, how are they even different? Ilma started muttering, even if we just stick to evolutions that come from gale wyverns, there are so many. Why not just pick the strongest and head towards that? Tamling asked, and frankly it wasn't the worst idea. However, I could tell Ray was about to respond to that. Strongest isn't something so easily measured. Consider yesterday's fight, Ray pointed out. Hyuka already has her own strength. She should choose something that enhances what she already has. Poison and order ability then, Ilma says, passing the booklet to Tamling who begins to leaf through it. With her eyes closed she begins to recite from memory, sulfur poison you'd want a way to deliver it from range. Let me think. Smoke, ash, mist, fog, or cloud wyverns would be the best bet there. As for durability, dust maybe. Honestly, starting from gale you don't have many choices in that unless you want to aim for a triple element elder stage evolution, but only Ray and you would be alive to see something like that. She could do a horizontal evolution, Tamling suggested, shrugging as Ilma's face twisted into a scowl. Sure, it adds a lot to her needed XP, but it opens up a lot more options, doesn't it? The issue with that would be that my stats would still be low, I said, with Ray and Tamling nodding in understanding while Ilma was still confused as to what I said. They don't show the exact stats in this information, but based on what I have seen I am expecting a large boost from my juvenile evolution. Enough that I won't have to worry about a random hob braining me. Ilma though, once it was explained to her, had an idea. You were a lesser wyvern, and now you are a regular gale wyvern, she said smiling at me suddenly. But you could be a greater wyvern if you did a horizontal evolution, right? She grabbed the booklet back from Tamling and flipped to the page she needed. You could evolve into a young greater lake wyvern, I think. You have that ability called breathes through her skin, right? It would take some effort, but with proper training you could meet the requirements for that and it would probably be a better stat boost than the one that you got for becoming a young gale wyvern, plus it would set you up for a dual-element juvenile evolution. At first I wasn't so sure, but for all of Ilma's flaws, being unpersuasive was definitely not one of them. Why does the Adventurers Guild rank teams different from individuals? Because a proper team working together can handle way more than their stats would indicate. Meanwhile an individual is utterly dependent on their own ability, so they have to be much stronger in order to handle even half of what a team of the same rank could. Sure, they get a lot more experience and money because they don't have to split either, but most people who go it alone die before they reach C rank. A guild receptionist speaking to a new D-rank adventurer 6 hours before he died alone in the wilderness. Asterisk Kingdom of Grisel, 2 years ago asterisk. Farmer, Tamling Marispov. The sun was hot, but then the sun was always hot in Grisel. I was used to it and yet I was never unbothered by it. I would pray for rain, but the storms of Grisel were as unpleasant as they were short. The rain often seemed to come from nowhere at all with the sun still shining and not a cloud in the sky even as rain fell down like a waterfall. 15 minutes later, the squall would end just as abruptly. The combination of rain and sun made Grisel ideal for farming year-round. I was plowing one of our fields, guiding the oxen and using my ability, breaking dirt, to ease the difficulty. I was, like many a young man just reaching adulthood in the area, bored and unsatisfied with my work. I didn't want to be a farmer my whole life like my dad was. No, I wanted to go to faraway places and see new things. I wanted to be an adventurer. Neither Dad nor Mom took my goal seriously, barely even acknowledging me when I brought it up. I had learned the spear skill practicing with a broken hoe behind the house. I am sure I could gain a real class and slay monsters. Or I would have if my little sister hadn't tattled on me and I ended up getting a lecture from Dad. "Son," he said to me with a stern look on his face. "You don't know how good you've got it. Before your granddad moved the family down here to Grissel, we lived in Bolkus, and Bolkus doesn't have the same kind of security against monsters as Grissel does." He told me that I had no idea what monsters were like, but I wasn't like him. I didn't want to run, I wanted to fight. The sun was hot that day, when the village bell rang. I stopped plowing and started to take the ox back to the barn. I moved slowly. I wasn't worried about why the bell was ringing, it was probably just some proclamation or another from the Lord, but I did want to milk as much time away from working out of this as possible. It struck me as odd that the bell was still ringing, but nothing more than that. What was there to worry about in Grissel? The first inkling I got that something was truly wrong was when I saw the small village, more a collection of farmhouses than a proper settlement, and the people fleeing it. People were shouting, running, taking whatever they could carry and loading it onto wagons or backs and leaving for the east. "The hell are you dawdling for, Tam?" My dad's shout startled me. "Get the wagon out, we are leaving now." "What is happening?" I asked in utter confusion. "Now Tamling," my dad bellowed, and I jumped to do what he asked me even as he was running around grabbing supplies of various kinds. Mom and Tessa, my little sister, were doing likewise as I started hitching the oxen to the cart. "Mom, what is going on?" I was bewildered, and starting to feel the anxiety creeping up on me. The icy feeling of terror freezing even the heat of Grissel's sun. "It's a swarm," she answered while loading as fast as she could. "Get the cart moving now, your dad and I will catch up." The last thing I wanted to do was be separated from my parents, but I nodded and did what my mom asked. Tessa and I started the cart moving towards the main road. A part of me was worried that I would never see my parents again, but I didn't push the oxen and they did indeed catch up. To my surprise, my dad was carrying a spear. A real spear with a long blade, and it seemed to belong in his hands. "Dad, where did you get that?" Bolkus was a more dangerous country than Grissel, he gave me an answer, and yet it did indeed answer the question as well as it needed to. At any rate. I hadn't had time to think yet. I had been too rushed and stunned to think much about what was going on, but now I did. A swarm was coming. What would happen to our farm? I had wished to leave it all my life, and now I was heading away from it, realizing that I might never see it again. I swallowed, trying to wet my dry throat as I croaked out, "Are we moving fast enough? Will we be safe?" My parents didn't answer me. Their grim silence terrified me, but I tried to get a grip on my fear. I had always wanted to be a hero, and now I had to be one. Not for me, but for my sister, who was shivering on the seat beside me, her arms wrapped around her body as if she was cold. The sun was hot that day, though it cooled down at night. We joined the camp of others who were running east, and I was relieved to see soldiers and guards around the camp. They looked us over, noted my father, and let us in easily. Others who were running were rejected, and I could see why. We had brought our own food, our own water, and Dad was armed and seemed ready to fight. Others had fled with nothing, and no one was willing to share when they had to look after their own. I thought it was wrong, but what could I do? I wanted to be a hero, and already I was willing to throw people away who might have been my neighbors and friends just yesterday. I couldn't be that kind of person, so I approached one of the soldiers. They watched me warily, although I had no idea why. I was less a hero right now than a fool trembling out of terror. "Sir?" I asked one of them. "Could I ask a question?" "Kid, I bet I know what you are going to ask. We can't let just anyone into this camp." The soldier answered. His tone was regretful, but it was also unyielding. "Even just to sit. Desperation turns honest men and women into thieves and cutthroats. I don't blame them for it, but neither can I trust anyone who can't look after themselves. That was my question though, sir. I couldn't meet the man's eyes. Couldn't they be armed with farm tools? A couple of hits with a hammer and a hoe is a spear, and any mallet can be used as a club. They can fight. It won't work out, kid. It's a swarm. In 2 months the goblins will be dead, but there won't be a scrap of food for 200 miles. I balled up my fists, but that was that. Then, would you teach me how to fight? At the very least then, I would be able to do something. The request seemed to amuse him somewhat. Hey kid, what is your name? He asked me. Tamling, I answered. I'm Ravan, he replied, holding his hand out for me to shake. Happy to meet you, although I wish it was during a better time. I took his hand and shook it. 4 days into the goblin swarm. I hadn't seen any goblins yet, just more and more desperate people. I was starting to wonder if we had needed to run so quickly. Couldn't we have gathered more supplies? Prepared better? Were the goblins really that close behind us? The answer was yes. We were attacked that night by what felt like countless goblins pouring out of the darkness that waited where the torchlight ended. I watched the fight, holding a makeshift spear I had scavenged from scrap we had come across. On the surface, there seemed to be no reason to worry. My father slaughtered the goblins like he was helping the local butcher. A single swing of his spear, which was a thrusting weapon anyway, would kill 2 or 3 at a time. Other farmers also fought with whatever they had on hand. They weren't as good as Dad, but they still killed goblins by the dozen every minute. But the goblins kept coming, minute after minute, and then hour after hour. People were pulled down and torn apart, exhaustion and numbers grinding them down until they died. Dad had fought more carefully than the others, more like the soldiers, saving his stamina. 3 hours later, it ended just as abruptly as a gristle rain. That wasn't even the edge of the swarm, just a wandering group that broke off from it. How many goblins had attacked? How many were killed? No one stopped to count, and in the coming days countless more attacked. More people died, supplies ran low, and even with the threat of goblins the group began to turn on each other. The soldiers and guards were hired by a lesser lord, and were more concerned with the welfare of their charge than what happened in the rest of the camp. Theft and fights became common. The first blood I ever spilled in my entire life was not that of a goblin, but of a man who tried to sneak food away from our wagon. I planted my spear in his stomach and watched as he stumbled back, disbelief on his face. He didn't die quickly, not until Dad put his spear through the man's heart. I should have finished him off instead of letting him suffer, but I had not wanted to kill him. I hadn't even wanted to hurt him, but the man's family was put out from the camp. A young woman and a young girl. If the world had been different it could have been my mom and my sister. The resigned grief on the young woman's face would haunt me for the rest of my life. I hadn't personally put a blade through them myself, but I knew that I had killed 3 people that night. 6 days into the goblin swarm. We knew, of course, that this day would come. The city of Plie was only a few days away, and our food wouldn't last that long. Dad spoke with Ravan quietly, and came back to tell us not to worry. He had made a deal with Ravan. Our oxen would be butchered at Plie and my dad and I would work as warriors for the Lord, and we would be somewhat taken care of. It wouldn't exactly be enough, but where others would have nothing we would have something. That night was when I saw my first hobgoblin. The monster was as large as a man, larger than many, and broke the shaky line that the fatigued farmers had been holding. Goblins flooded into the camp and the soldiers pulled back to protect the Lord. Even they were hard-pressed as well. More hobgoblins were emerging from the shadows of night to challenge them. I had trained, and I had watched, but I was not prepared to fight. I did anyway, because my mother and sister were behind me. It might sound foolish, but in my mind I kept telling myself to be a hero. That I was a hero. Heroes don't run, heroes don't back down, heroes don't fall. I was stupid kid, telling myself I was a hero as if that would make it so. But I wasn't one. I don't know how many I killed, but it wasn't many. I wasn't my dad, I wasn't Ravan. A few levels of spearman and warrior did not make me a fighter. And the goblins just kept coming, and eventually I was too slow. They grabbed me, pulling me down, and I struggled as Tessa screamed. They bit and scratched me, eating me alive even as I fought, but I wasn't going to give up until I bled my last. Suddenly, they were pulled off me. I saw my dad, standing tall with his spear in hand. He was bloody, he was hurt, and he didn't care at all. He neither slowed or stopped as he killed the goblins that had swarmed me. He shouted at us to follow him and we did, although I had lost my weapon in the clamor. At the edge of the battle, Dad handed his spear to me, my mom hugged Tessa and myself, and he told us to run. My parents turned back and fought the goblins that would have followed us while I grabbed my sister's hand and ran. I wasn't thinking. The significance of what had happened wouldn't hit me for another minute, but I didn't turn around when it did. That was the last time I saw my parents. I will never forget it. I will never forget the overwhelming grief that scene inspires in me, neither will I forget the overflowing love that they showed for me and my sister. It would have been so easy to sink into that grief and hate, but a hero doesn't do that. A hero is driven by the weight of the sacrifices they carry with them, not broken under their weight. I would not throw away my parents' sacrifice, I would take care of my sister and live. 3 weeks into the goblin swarm. Congratulations! You have reached Commoner level 5. You have gained +1 to all stats other than MGC. You have gained the class ability, Hunger Resistance, Minor. I started giggling hysterically at that notification. Of course I got that now. Requiring less food would have been so useful 2 weeks ago when there was food to ration, but now? Now it would only prolong my suffering. Both Tessa and I were thinner, sickly even. Tessa rarely talked, barely making a sound except when she started screaming at night. She couldn't concentrate and nearly stabbed me when I startled her on accident. She turned 11 years old on the streets of Plie, hungry and wary that someone might try to take the little nook of an alley we called home now. I never wanted to give her a knife. My happy, joyful, playful but ultimately peaceful sister? I could never have imagined her picking up a weapon, but things happened to the vulnerable on the street. Even a girl as young as my sister wasn't safe from cruelty of all kinds. Without food or shelter, mankind devolved into monsters themselves. 3 weeks ago, that man mugging another homeless and impoverished person was probably a good person. 3 weeks ago, he would have had a family to talk him out of something so cruel, or perhaps he still had his family and he was doing whatever he had to do to take care of them. I never told my sister, but I had unlocked several classes over the past 2 weeks. Thug, cutthroat, burglar, prostitute. Unlocking a class was supposed to be a reason to celebrate, but there was nothing good or heroic in how I unlocked those. I wouldn't take them, but they would always be in my status as a reminder of what I had done. My only comfort was that Tessa did not have to unlock them herself. 5 weeks into the goblin swarm. Monsters are hated because they prey on man. They kill, rip apart, and consume humans. It turns out that there really isn't much of a difference between a man and a monster. 7 weeks into the goblin swarm. The sun was hot that day. I can never forget how the heat baked the putrid stench of the city into my nose. It was the smell of death and sickness and rotten heat. For the last 7 weeks, Pili had been surrounded by a sea of goblins. They couldn't get through the wall, although there were areas they had tunneled under, but neither could the human forces in the city do anything to face the solid mass of goblins outside the gates. There were so many goblins that you couldn't see the ground. The land had been a writhing mass of screeching monsters for as far as the eye could see. But in the 7th week, that changed. Explosions rocked the city even though the blasts did not land inside it or even near it. Fire fell from the sky like raindrops on the goblins on one side of the city, on the other the writhing mass was stilled as ice crept through their ranks. The Archmages had come and delivered the opening strikes that would break the siege of the city. I didn't see it personally, but the tales spread like plague. S-rank adventurers sweeping goblins aside by the tens of thousands, mages directing walls of fire to consume the beasts, The armies of man driving the goblins away. No, I didn't even try to watch what was likely a legendary display of power. I was aiming for some of the food that this army must be carrying with them. I prayed to all the gods of the world that they could help feed the city. Tessa was sick, and I had seen others die of the same wasting illness. If she didn't eat, she would waste away into nothing but dry and pallid skin stretched over her bones. I was desperate, willing to do whatever it took for even the smallest bit of food. The vanguard entered the city first, and I approached to beg or barter whatever I could. I held on to my father's spear, which I had managed to keep this long, willing to barter away his memory if that was what it took. "Hey, that spear!" A familiar voice called out, "By the gods! Tamling, is that you?" But I was too late, because the city was already full of goblins. Everywhere. I saw hobs killing my father, goblins ripping my mother apart and eating her, torturing my sister and laughing with their awful low. Present day *. "Hey, wake up." A soft hand on my shoulder and soft voice woke me with a start. "You were having a nightmare." Yes, I had been. I took a moment to catch my breath, before looking into Ray's concerned eyes. I raised my hand, brushing a fallen strand of her hair back behind her ear. How I had ended up here, with her next to me, I could hardly fathom. A farm boy pining after an immortal, he might as well wish to become a hero. "Yeah. I'm fine now," I say as my heartbeat calms. "Thank you." She doesn't say anything more, there is nothing to say. The weight of her head against my chest is reminder enough that I am free of that part of my life. Things have changed so much, and even after a nightmare like that I was able to chuckle at a thought it brought up. "Something funny, Tam," Ray murmured sleepily. "Just wondering how my sister will react when I introduce you to her," I say with a smile. "It is a good thing she is already in the temple, because she will probably need a healer for the shock." I watched the stars for a while as Ray fell asleep again, thinking about how life changes. From a farm boy who knew nothing of the world to an adventurer with an elf lover who was taking a wyvern to a lake so that it could be half drowned to unlock an evolution. Maybe hero wasn't impossible after all. Chapter 42 Cadence Lee as Hugo Puff. So it turns out that just as physics still kicks ass even in a world with a system and magic, biology also still applies. It is a bit bent out of shape compared to what I used to know, but it isn't gone. Which is why, despite having the racial ability breathes through her skin, I could still drown. Admittedly, I didn't drown easily. The ability did still work, but I think my current body needed more oxygen than the water around me could provide. Maybe if there was more oxygen in the water I wouldn't need to breathe at all. Or maybe not. I could be just too large and energetic for the ability to fulfill my oxygen needs. I probably would never know, and I had more important things to focus on right now, like my magical battle against Ilma. A half-naked Ilma, who had taken off some of her clothes to avoid getting them wet and was just wearing a slightly longer tunic and a manic smile, was standing in the shallows of the lake we had hiked to. The issue for me, I thought as I sat under the water and glared at her, was how to use the water to block the fiery bolt she would throw at me as soon as I surfaced. As part of the plan to unlock the Greater Lake Wyvern evolution, I needed to use water to fight, but I didn't know how to use water magic yet. Ilma had given me a brief lesson, but then said that it would be better for me to gain the skill in combat instead of from a lecture. The lectures would come, but a combat unlock could help gain new future evolutions and classes. So here I was, mostly using aerokinesis and air magic to blast the air out of my lungs hard enough to throw water at her. I had yet to block a fiery bolt doing that, and even though she was holding back a ton, Ilma's fire hurt. Plus, I had learned that behind that snobbish noble exterior was a complicated young woman. And by a complicated young woman I mean to say that she is a pyromaniac and a sadist. Possibly even a sadomasochist given how much she was shouting at me to hit her. Wait. I had agreed to this. Am I a masochist? No, I don't actually enjoy this. I am just doing it because it needs to be done for my evolution. Stop hiding and come out, Huka. Ilma shouted with a wicked smile. I promise I'll tone this one down. Liar. My perception might be relatively low, but I can see the crazy gleam in your eye, Ilma. You are just happy to have a punching bag to use your spells on. Yet, I did have to surface. Not just because I did eventually need to breathe, although I could sit underwater for a very long time, but because this was the whole reason we were here. I needed to spend significant time underwater, fight with water, be hurt in water, rest and heal in water to unlock the greater lake wyvern evolution. That was why Ray and Tamling were just sitting on a nearby rock and watching the torture session that Ilma called training instead of helping me, although Tamling was wise enough to only be watching me and not Ilma. Smart kid. Well, there was no use delaying anymore. I tensed my legs against the lake bottom and spread my wings sluggishly through the water, using them to shove the water down and throw me to the water's surface. I tried to insert my mana into the water even as I opened my mouth to exhale the compressed air I was holding when I reached the optimal depth, causing a geyser of water to erupt in Ilma's direction. I burst out of the water just in time to see Ilma's fire evaporate the water I sent her way and another fiery bolt pierce the steam and slam into my stomach. You have been burned. You have lost 10 horsepower. Oh. Can't she hold back more? That will take hours to heal. She would have shot me again if I hadn't dived back into the water. Fiery bolts landed on the surface of the lake behind me as I dived underwater. Swimming was difficult, but I managed. I had to manage because that was one of the skills I was hoping to train today. Oh no, I'm not letting you run and make me wait this time. Ilma shouted as she cackled, you won't level if you don't really put effort into this, Yuka. The pressure from the explosion that followed buffeted me underwater. Ilma hadn't held back with that one. Would her mana even be able to keep up with her expenditure? More importantly, is she trying to kill me? Oh Pody, please don't let me be sent back to you by a sadomasochistic pyromaniac who got too into training, I prayed silently, yet fervently. I promise I won't call you a pervert anymore. Well, I won't for at least one life, but no more, because you know what you have done. Dodge has leveled up. Dodge is now level 5. Swimming has leveled up. Swimming is now level 6. Woohoo! That was the first time Dodge had leveled up and the second time Swimming had leveled up today. Yet somehow, it didn't feel quite as good to gain a level when I was hiding underwater from a one-woman artillery barrage. Another wave of pressure shook the depths of the lake as Ilma continued to laugh. This time I was able to use the water around me to alleviate it slightly. You have learned the skill, Water Magic. Water Magic is now level 1. Ha ha ha. Now I shall have my revenge. Asterisk 15 minutes later asterisk. Thank you for healing me, I whimpered to Chow Earl, who was kneeling next to my smoking form, restoring it to some form of normality with the power of his god. She is thanking you, Ray translated for me, looking far more amused than concerned. I have to confess that feeling that sudden burst of confidence from her only to see her slapped down so quickly was kind of hilarious though. How was I supposed to know that the sadomasochistic pyromaniac psycho would barbecue me if Right, because she is a sadomasochistic pyromaniac psycho, of course. It did take you a while to notice that Ilma likes fire a bit too much, Hyuka, Ray, who could feel the direction of my thoughts, said and started laughing. I thought you had noticed during our last request or I would have given you a warning. Are you still planning to continue this training, Hyuka? Chow Earl asked mildly, you don't have to do this, you know. Well yeah, I don't have to do any of this and it sure as hell isn't pleasant. It hurts and it hurts a lot. However, I've felt a lot worse pain and I want what I get from this a lot more than I am worried about pain. I need to become stronger. I don't want to die so easily this life. And when I do die I want to rake in those points. There is no way I'll give up. When I say as much, minus the part about incarnation, to Chow Earl, he grins and his magic flares. Well said, he watches as my healing speeds up. And it looks like Lord Yukis approves of your ambition as well. I will take that as a good thing, so long as Chow Earl doesn't fall over screaming, anyway. I don't really expect him to though. I don't know much about the gods, but Chow Earl was more than happy to tell me about yuccas when I asked through Ray, who promptly left me to his lecture and went off to do something else. The short version of that lecture was that yuccas didn't particularly care about why someone was motivated towards their ambition. The god only cared about how motivated you were and how ambitious your goal was. He wasn't about to check the details. Admittedly, that wasn't exactly true based on what Chow Earl said, but it was more or less accurate. Enough that I wasn't worried about giving my healer a stroke. A few minutes later, I was back on my feet, and my self-imposed torture began again. One day later. I was exhausted. We were heading back to Evergold, having probably accomplished enough to unlock the Greater Lake Wyvern evolution. I had thought that we would have to do more, but apparently I was wrong. In fairness, I can't imagine many wyverns that would sleep in a lake on purpose. Or that they would be able to breathe underwater long enough to take a nap and have allies to watch over them during that to make sure they didn't drown. However, unlike my days as a toad, I was not very comfortable sleeping in the water. I had gotten very little sleep last night and it was making the journey back home hellish. While some of it was spent in the air carrying Ray and scouting the land ahead, a good chunk of it was spent being forced to carry my tormentor, Ilma, who was lecturing me on basic magical theory. She figured that as long as she was teaching me, she shouldn't have to walk. Frankly, I didn't disagree, although part of my agreement was out of fear. Regardless, her lecture was quite informative and also apparently a massive oversimplification. I am trying to explain one of the prime forces of existence, Ilma said when I asked for the complete version. Do you honestly think that it is so easy to explain? Well, yes actually. I mean, she had learned it, right? So clearly it could be taught, or so I thought. Most mages you meet won't know more than the most basic bits of magical theory. Ilma explained, a lot of them are reliant on their class abilities to do much beyond the most basic magic. Even someone like myself, who received a professional education, was only taught a small portion of the knowledge on the subject. That sounded incredibly stupid. Why would someone want to go to a magic school that didn't teach magic? Oh, but it does. What they teach takes decades for your average hedgemage to figure out, Ilma revealed. However, higher knowledge is reserved for higher-level individuals. Once you learn the basics you are required to leave and gain experience in the real world for a time. I was less than convinced of the system's efficacy, but it wasn't like I would be allowed into that magical academy, so it wasn't an issue really. Still, getting information secondhand like this. Most of the information on how magic worked was either definitely unknown or restricted to higher-tier mages than Ilma, and she instead focused on what worked. I did get to learn some mana theory, namely how it took on properties based on the area it was in. Fundamentally, 1 unit of mana was always 1 unit of mana, whether it was fire element or water element or something more esoteric like swamp element. In fact, calling them elements was something of a stretch because the properties were so affected by the location. While a mediocre and uneducated magic user might think that the existence of the air magic skill means that air elemental mana is a thing and just one thing, Ilma locuted. They are wrong. The air on our hike is different from the air in a city. The air in a cave is different from the air on a mountain peak. The air on the coast of the sea is different from the air on the coast of a lake. If you were to compare the mana you found at one lake to that of another, you find subtle differences between them because there are no elements. Merely mana, and the properties it takes. While I had almost no experience with magic in my last world, this seemed absolutely nothing like what I had experienced there, and I suspected that magic was different from world to world. Similar enough that I could use it, but different enough that I would have to learn as well. So would the mana we carry in our own pool be attuned to our own properties? I ask, suspecting the answer. Indeed it is. That is how we recover mana, by converting the properties of the mana around us into our own and absorbing it. So then if we found mana that was similar in property to our own mana, I focused my limited acuity and willpower to keep my train of thought until the end. Would we be able to use that environmental mana as our own? Ilma started laughing and it took her a while to calm down, taking deep gasping breaths of air as she bent over. "I'm sorry," she said, still giggling. "I'm not laughing at you so much as laughing at myself. I asked the exact same question and was told by my teacher that someone always does ask it every year. The short answer is, yes. The slightly longer answer is, it will never occur, so why think about it? The best anyone can do is find mana that has properties close to their own, because that will increase the rate at which they recover. Yeah, this was nothing like my last world at all. But it had to be, at least slightly, because I had been able to learn magic before I had met Ilma, right? Why was I able to pick up Manasence, mana manipulation, and air magic using the knowledge I had before if magic here is plainly so different? Or is this like asking why biology still seems to function for animals and sapients here when every monster relies on the system for growth? Maybe. Maybe there are some basic rules that always apply to every world, or perhaps there are rules that would apply to every world but something, the various systems, perhaps, bends them out of shape to make new rules so that every world is different. I haven't the expertise or the knowledge to know for sure. As far as I know, Pody rolls a dice every time I am born and randomizes all the possibilities on the spot. It is something to keep an eye on for the future. Asterisk back in Evergold asterisk. Dancing has leveled up. Dancing is now level 4. Singing has leveled up. Singing is now level 3. So I might have drawn a bit of a crowd with my performance. It was kind of embarrassing. But how am I supposed to raise my skills without practice? Knowing Pody that there are 2 points in the bag right there and I can't imagine it would be hard to level them, just time consuming. Wait. Can I level my acting skill if I perform in front of an audience? I guess I'll find out. Now playing, The Life of Princess Hammer, with me, Hilka the Wyvern, as the lead actress. Is it silly to pretend like that? Yes. It feels stupid and idiotic, but that is part of the point. If I am trying to portray 2 roles at once, and one of which is a silly and very not dangerous wyvern that absolutely no one should worry about, acting like a fool is kind of useful. Plus, no one can understand me anyway, so they don't know what I am acting as or even that I am. It is still incredibly humiliating, but it kills multiple birds with one stone, so I will let it pass. Asterisk later that night asterisk. Before I go to sleep, I decide to check my stats. Over the past 5 days I have been trained and lectured in magic, writing, and reading by Ilma. Tracking, sprinting, and stealth by Ray. And learned about teamwork from Ravan. Even Chow Earl, Carlin, and Tamling had helped out and taught me the basics of several random skills. Name, Hilka species. Young Gale Wyvern level, 2/10 experience, 195 320ths. Class, Hunter. Class level, 27 health, 454 454ths mana, 54 54ths stamina, 100th. Statistics, STR, 148 and, 172 vit, 141 agi, 197 dex, 111. Per, 168 AC, 111 will, 118 cha, 107 mgc, 108. Lock, 163. Abilities. Presence class, Hunter's Rest class, breathes through her skin. Racial, Poison Spice class, Blood Trail class, Endless Hunt racial, Toxic Skin racial, Toxin Control, minor racial, Regeneration. Minor lesser racial, Scale Armor, minor racial, Envenomed Bite, Hatchling Comatose Lizard racial, Infravision racial, Saludivore racial, Strong Stomach racial, Aerokinesis racial, Gale Wyvern Hide racial, Lesser Wyvern Hide racial, Poison Resistance, major racial, Disease Resistance, minor racial, Better First Impression, Healthy Thoughts, First Words, Killing Blow skills, Acrobatics, 1 acting, 3 air magic, 4 ambush, 4 analysis, 3 cartography, 2 charge, 5 cleaning, 4 climbing, 3 composing, 2 construction, 3 cooking, 4 charm, 3 crafting, 5 dancing, 6 Dagger, 1 digging, 7 dodge, 7 drawing, 2 earth magic, 1 etiquette, 3 fire magic, 1 flight, 3 gardening, 1 intimidate, 2 jumping, 6 leatherworking, 2 mana manipulation, 7 manascence, 10 meditation, 9 poetry, 1 pottery, 2 reading, 4 singing, 6 spear, 3 sprinting, 6 swimming, 6 stealth, 7 taunt, 1 teamwork, 3 throwing, 4 tracking, 5 trap making, 7 unarmed combat, 1 water magic, 2 weaving, 2 writing, 8 talent. The whole of our society is obsessed with talent in our youth, and yet it so often doesn't matter. We humans tend to think of ourselves as superior to the other sapients in some ways because their talents are limited, and ours can be anything. However, how many people actually discover their talents, and of those how many have talents that are useful? Every child hopes to be talented in the sword and to become a great adventurer, and rarely does a child manage to pick up a sword and learn the skill to check. This is an example of the great weakness in human talent. There are thousands of skills, and few have the time or resources to find what they are talented in among them. How many ever get the chance to learn how to sense mana, much less manipulate it? How many go beyond that to ever learn a magic skill? Trying to find all your talents is lunacy. You are better off working hard to raise the skills you want than chasing dreams. A shopkeeper talking to his son who wanted to learn the sword. Asterisk Kingdom of Balkis, City of Seer, 12 years ago asterisk. Commoner Ilmazhotov's Poff. If there is one thing I have learned, it was that the world was hateful. You have been struck. You have lost 3 horsepower. That good will be met with evil and kindness with cruelty. Mercy is the luxury of the strong, and no one is strong enough to be able to afford it indefinitely. You have been struck. You have lost 4 horsepower. She's running that way. A child yelled with malicious glee as he picked up another stone. In the alley, get her. Get her. You have been struck. You have lost 1 horsepower. Weakness is not pitied, or even ignored, it is seen as an invitation to take. Fuck. The little bitch could fit through a gap that small? An older child, Kivas, spat and tossed his stone aside. Just proves she's a witch. A bitchy witch. Another called out and they all laughed. As if no one had ever thought of that insult before. As if I had never heard it before. I'm not a witch, I whisper into the shadows of the empty alley. The world is hateful though. It does not care, and neither do the kids who chased me with stones. I was just another orphan girl, and one who had the misfortune of being distinguished from all of the others. You got your beautiful red hair from your father's side of the family, she used to tell me with a smile. Even though your dad doesn't have it, all of his brothers and sisters do. You should be proud to be connected to that heritage. What heritage that was, I will never know because the world took my mother away from me a week later. Dad had died a year before, but that is just how it was in Balkis if you lived in one of the small towns. Monsters were everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before some kind of disaster occurred. In the end, I was brought to Seer to be placed in the orphanage here. It burned down barely a month after I arrived and was never rebuilt. The other children blamed me for the fire, and even though I swore before a priest of LA that I hadn't started the fire, they still believed I caused it somehow. Mom was a healer and had started to teach me magic so that I could follow after her. I had the skills manascence, mana manipulation, and fire magic. I had foolishly thought to be helpful and used my magic to help light cooking fires and hearth fires in the orphanage. And I had red hair, so I must be a witch who tricked the priest with my evil magic. As if that was even possible. Even the secret priests who worshipped the god of secrets could only hide the truth for a time from the clergy of LA. No one could hide from their sight forever, and someone like me wouldn't be able to hide at all. My aching stomach brought me back to the present. I could ignore the pain of being hit by rocks, but the pain of an empty stomach was far more insistent. How long had it been since I had not been some degree of hungry? As long as I had been on the streets, So at least 2 years, I suppose. It would have been easy to beg or to steal or to whore myself. As young as I was, people would take pity on me even with my hair. That same youth and hair would make me particularly attractive to the disgusting freaks that prey on orphans. As for theft, I had magic that I could use to start distractions and even grab things from a distance. But I couldn't let go of my parents' lessons. There will always be people who say or do bad things, Dad had said to me, so many years ago when I came to him crying from other kids teasing me. But you don't need to sink to their level. Rise above it and be better, and if you are better than them, why should their words matter at all? Everyone has an ideal they strive for, Mom told me one night after Dad had died. But they make excuses for why they can never reach that goal. Don't make excuses, Ilma. Be the best you and let others be the worst them. I would not beg, I would not steal, I would not sell my dignity for a mere bite to eat. I was better than that, better than those who chased and harassed me. I had survived these past couple of years by working as I could. A scrap of wood, a bit of paint, and I had made a sign to advertise what I could do. Every so often the kids would chase me down and break it, and I would have to make a new one, but it served its purpose. Where others made signs begging for a copper and prayed to the gods for the generosity of passerby, mine said, teaching skills. Manasence, manipulation, reading, writing and arithmetic. Will work for food or copper. All skills a healer needed, all skills my mom had taught me and that I had wished to ignore in favor of playing. I say a small prayer for my dead mom and dad for making me stay and learn. Unlike so many other parents, they had given me tools to survive even should the worst happen to them. Hopefully today I would find someone who wanted to learn from me for a while and could provide food for a couple of weeks. I never asked for much, I could survive being somewhat hungry. A shadow blocked the sun for a moment, and I wrenched myself from my thoughts to smile politely at whomever had stopped before me, only to blink in surprise. Oh, you were teaching skills, little girl? The lady spoke, her voice like music. I barely looked at her before bowing my head, knowing to always respect my betters. And this woman, dressed as she was in a silken robe, rich in dye and design, with jewelry glittering on her fingers and in her hair, was undoubtedly a noble. Yes, my lady, although I wouldn't dare claim to be able to teach someone like you. You speak quite well too, she mused. Tell me, where did you learn all of this? My mother and father taught me. My mother was a healer and my father was an alchemist. Was. No, don't answer, I know enough. The noble glanced to her side and gave an order to a man who I hadn't noticed. Bertrand, take her. Noble or not, when I heard those 2 words I turned and ran. I didn't even make it 3 steps before a gloved hand caught my wrist. I twisted, fire in my other hand, and as I tried to escape, but my fire died before I could use it. In fact, I couldn't use my magic at all. And without my magic I was nothing but a starving child. I slumped, there was no point to struggling. I was brought into a carriage by the lady's servant and sat across from the lady herself. I was probably going to be taken as a slave. Slavery was illegal in Balkis, but that was never enforced with the kingdom in constant chaos. A lady like this. She could do pretty much whatever she wanted with me and no one would care. Oh, Bertrand, look at her. She looks like a criminal consigned to the gallows. Lady Hannett, you did just have me abduct her off the street without an explanation. The servant next to me sighed. Anyone would believe that you had some nefarious goal. True, true. Lady Hannett returned her focus to me and asked, what is your name, child? Ilmazhotova, lady. I answered quietly. There was no point staying silent, she would undoubtedly get whatever answers she wanted from me eventually. Well, little Ilma, I am Maria Devon-Jashui, a countess from Fracas. She said with a smile, confirming her aristocratic origins. And you, Ilma, give me a particularly good feeling. So I have an offer to make you. Asterisk Kingdom of Fracas, Royal Academy of Magic, 11 years and 6 months ago asterisk. I couldn't help but be nervous as I looked at the academy. It seemed more like a palace out of a dream than a school to me. I watched in awe as I gazed open-mouthed at the building floating above my head. No, the buildings, because the palace-like entrance was the only building actually on the ground. The rest of the campus was in the air, the buildings enchanted to fly unconnected by bridges of light. This was supposed to be my home for the next 8 years. Countess Jashui had brought me here to fracas, tested me, and then adopted me. I was now Ilma Jashui, although I was not a noble, and I was going to be one of the only commoners in an academy that was made for nobles and royalty. I took a deep breath and then made my way inside. I was greeted by the servants and directed to my quarters, which involved taking a floating platform up past the roof and stepping out onto one of the light bridges. I did my best not to look down, but my eyes were drawn down to the mostly transparent bridge. I hate to admit that the first challenge that I wavered at was merely walking across the bridge to the dormitory. Suddenly, I couldn't get enough air into my lungs and I felt like the world was spinning. This only increased my terror, because now I wasn't sure I could take a step without falling. I think I might have collapsed right there if someone hadn't caught me. "Careful there, miss. The bridges can take some getting used to. Here, let me help you." I was shaking as I was gently guided onto solid ground again, albeit solid ground that was also floating in the air. It was only there that I was able to get enough air to thank my rescuer. Then I started to speak, but as I looked up at the person who had helped me there was one thing I noticed above all others. It wasn't his fine clothes, although they were nicer than any I had ever seen even with the Countess, and it wasn't his handsome face, although that was enough to make me blush considering he had his arm around my waist. No, it was the golden circlet glinting on his head. I immediately tried to bow and almost fell over as I started to stammer, "My Puerto Rico prince. I didn't realize, I am sorry for my rudeness." He merely laughed, gently grabbing my shoulder and making me raise my head. Rudeness? What sort of man would I be if I left a young lady in distress? Of course, it would surprise nobody, not even myself, that Prince Laos of Fracas would end up being my first crush. Foolish, of course. He was a prince 7 years my elder, and I was a foreign commoner from a war-torn country who was only 9 years old. I wasn't good enough for him and I knew it, but I wanted to be. I threw myself into my studies with a passion, determined to be better still. It wasn't like I could make friends here. I was here because I was talented in Renaissance and meditation, but in the end I was still just a commoner. In fact, if it weren't for the continued kindness of the prince, I might have been bullied nearly as bad as I had been back in Seer. He graduated a year later, but by then I had established something of a reputation in my class year. There was no one as hardworking, no one as dedicated, and no one as skilled or knowledgeable than me at our age. You may not be a noble, but you are better than the rest of the rabble, my noble classmates would say. Of course I was better than them. My contempt for other commoners was legendary. Anyone, even those without talent, can learn Renaissance and mana manipulation, I would say. Every single human can learn at least some magic that would improve their daily lives. Yet most don't, because they are lazy, or because they are stupid, or because they have allowed themselves to be brainwashed by superstition. How could I fail to be better than them? I picked up alchemy and studied some of the more esoteric magics in my 2nd year. In my 3rd year I had learned enough of enchanting to cast a blessing on the prince, who was getting married to a duke's heiress later that year. My youthful fantasies were broken, but I still felt I owed him anyway. Even though it still hurt, I was better than the other girls who gossiped about the heiress and just barely hid their distaste. After my 4th year, I was able to take a vacation and I decided to return to Seer, just to see where I had come from again. * Kingdom of Balkis, City of Seer, 7 years ago. * I suppose that a young, wealthy-looking lady would be a tempting target to the desperate types that lived on the streets that I was visiting. Perhaps someone might have tried to stop and rob me if it wasn't for the bodyguard generously lent to me by the Countess. I would like to imagine that I could handle myself, but the truth is that the various criminals here undoubtedly outlevel me right now. The years had not been kind to Seer, Not that they were ever kind in Balkis, and the city was both larger and more poor than it was when I had lived here before. It looked different, seeing it now that I was older. I can't even say that I recognized the streets because the ramshackle buildings had been torn down and rebuilt, shifting the very roads themselves. The Countess thought it was amusing when I talked like that, always telling me that I was far too young to talk like I was so old. My thoughts turned to her as I walked down the street she had picked me up on. It still remained, and I couldn't help but flip a few silver coins to a beggar who was sitting at the spot where I used to offer training. The spot where the Countess had seen me for the first time. "Oh. Thank you, my lady." He was an older man with scars, and he was missing a leg. "May the gods bless you, ma'am." "Surely. They already have. The gods have nothing to do with it. I am just passing the favor on." I smiled, of course, hiding my true thoughts. My own apathy, or quite possibly antipathy, towards the gods was not a common sentiment, and I was not so petty as to spit on someone's well-meant gratitude just because I had my own personal issues with the gods. I was better than that. The tensing of my bodyguard was all the warning I got before they spoke, and maybe you would be so kind as to pass some of that blessing our way, huh? I turned around to see a group of young toughs, led by a familiar face. Although I doubted Kivas recognized the young belle before him as the filthy orphan he had last seen as he chased her into an alley with rocks. "These streets are dangerous anyways," Kivas continued. "And as here gentleman would be happy to escort a lady around safe." "Why, Kivas, you and I both know that you are about as much of a gentleman as a goblin is an elf," I replied with a light tone. "I guess it shouldn't surprise me to find you here, and still attempting to bully girls no less." "Who the hell are you?" Kivas snarled, looking around warily now. Clearly he suspected a trap of some kind. "How do you know my name?" "A poor memory to go along with your other faults." "Well, I guess I am not surprised." I heaved a dramatic sigh. "I would have hoped that you would remember me, given my hair color." Even with that hint, there was only confusion on his face. I suppose, thinking about it now, that what was a major and dramatic part of my life was likely just an amusing few hours of diversion for him. It is fascinating, I feel, in a detached way, that something so important to one person can be so meaningless to another. Enough riddles. He drew a knife and showed it off menacingly. "How do you know who I am?" "Who are you?" "You used to call me the bitchy witch." I spoke lightly, raising a hand to my hair. "You would call me that as you and your gang chased me, throwing stones and laughing? Does that ring a bell?" His face was blank for a moment, but then it scrunched up as he started to think. A unique experience for him, I am sure. He lowered his knife slightly, as he squinted at me and looked me up and down. I am not sure if I should be glad that at least he wasn't leering at me given my age, or mad because he clearly hadn't even considered it despite not being all that much older. "You know her, Kay?" one of the toughs behind Kivas asked. "Yeah." Kivas answered slowly. "She was a refugee girl from a few years back. I thought she had died on the street somewhere." "I am surprised you even thought of me that much." I was impressed he had even bothered to wonder. "But the real question is, what happens now, Kivas?" His eyes narrowed and his jaw set, and I had my answer even before he spoke. I began to prepare myself for a fight, gathering my mana for an attack. "We weren't friends or nothing," he said aloud. "But I think I could give you a discount on your safety contribution. Call it a congratulations for having made it." I lost my grip on my mana out of sheer surprise. I knew how the gangs worked, and unless Kivas was a high-ranking member, or at the very least, a highly favored member, they'd make him cover the difference out of his own pocket. He actually was. "Being nice?" "Yeah, I threw some rocks at you with some other kids, but I ain't a kid anymore." He had noticed my surprise and replied to my unspoken question. "Not scared of magic anymore neither." "You couldn't have done nothing back then anyway, or you would have beat the lot of us then. Besides, refugees from the towns and villages bring business for us. They aren't competition." I was gaping in surprise at this point, and consciously had to close my mouth. That wasn't precisely an apology, But anyone could read between the lines and see that Kivas was basically admitting that he was wrong. Poor grammar aside, he even had some things rather well thought out too. I was tempted, oh, so tempted, to curse him. I had planned, no, it might be better to say that I had dreamed and fantasized about returning and casting a real curse on him. I had not actually sought him out, and was never going to seek him out, but if I came across Kivas in my visit, it would not be wrong to say that I had hoped for this scene to play out, but it had gone off script. Now I had a decision to make. I could forgive him, pay what he asked, and move on, perhaps even doing something for him before I go, just to help incentivize kindness a little bit. I could decide not to forgive him, but still pay what he asked and avoid a fight. Or I could attack him and curse him like I had planned to do. Mom and Dad had told me to be better. To be the best, even when others were at their worst. My mom had been a healer, and she had always worked to make things better around her by helping others. But it was just so hard. Why should I need to be better than others? Why do I have to carry that burden when others simply half-ass their lives? How much are you asking for me to hire you gentlemen? I asked, even though it grated, because I was better than the part of me that wanted to set him on fire. The reason I wasn't on the street and the reason that I had gone from a hungry orphan and an alien to a mudge eating at the same table as the nobility was because of my mom and dad's words. Why should I do it? Because it works. I am better than my luck stat. My life is not determined by my stats, it is determined by me. I had never imagined that I would spend my vacation teaching my old tormentor the basics of menace and mana manipulation, but sometimes life was strange. Asterisk Kingdom of Fracas, Royal Academy of Magic, 4 years ago asterisk. Did you hear about the new proposal from the prince? One of the younger girls in a group of them at a nearby table asked the rest. I might have been above gossiping myself, but surely there was nothing hypocritical if I was just listening, right? I normally wouldn't even listen, but even now I was still soft on the prince. I think that my impossible feelings were dying slower because they were impossible. After all, what is the difference between the impossible task of a commoner marrying a prince and the impossible task of a woman marrying an already married man? If anything, the latter was the more possible of the two. It was my common birth that made it impossible, not his own marriage. I did. Another answered, fanning herself. Shocking, wasn't it? I was in the library's common area, which didn't have any restrictions on noise unlike the study rooms. I generally used the study rooms, but sometimes I just felt more comfortable when surrounded by ambient noise. Today was one of those times, and despite my current distraction I had gotten a lot done. But it does make sense. One girl spoke slower, calculatingly. Why shouldn't the nobility control class choice among the commoners? We have education and knowledge that they do not, surely we know better than they do. Huh? Well, given the content of their discussion, it sounded like the prince had proposed to take away the right of the lowborn to choose their own classes. I could see why it was shocking and controversial. Nearly every kingdom considered it a natural right belonging to all sapients and humans. On the other hand, the concept of a natural right only stretched so far. A noble might not be able to order someone to take up the farmer class, but they could order them to work on a farm. They could conscript someone into a militia, even if that conscript refused to take a militiaman or soldier class. Personally, even though my own freedom was on the line, I was somewhere between approving and ambivalent to this idea. Few people ever filled all their class slots, and they could always abandon a class later, so why would it even be a problem if they were forced to take a class? If they aren't using that class in their daily life it won't level and therefore won't be useful, so a noble would only order a class taken if the person was going to use it. Refusal to take a class in that situation just seemed foolish. The next line jolted me out of my thoughts. But the serf class? Isn't that basically a slave class? When I heard that, I had to get up and walk over to the table where the girls were speaking. They were fellow students here, ladies a year or two younger than myself. Apologies, ladies, I greeted them with a slightly strained smile. but I couldn't help overhear your conversation. Would you mind if I joined in? I was a far better student than most of the gossips, some of whom I suspected were actually gossips, and that, plus my slightly older age, gave me just enough prestige that they let me join the conversation with only slight reluctance. Reluctance which faded as they dug into the news about the prince. Myself? I became quieter and quieter, eventually excusing myself and leaving the library. I couldn't trust the word of a single woman, especially one of the gossips. No, I had to double-check, and that meant talking to someone connected and informed. Someone connected, informed, and willing to speak to and answer a commoner's questions. Fortunately, despite the difference between my status and theirs, the teachers and professors here had high opinions of me. For the most part, anyway. Regardless, it didn't take me long at all to get that confirmation. The prince wasn't just pushing to allow nobles to demand their commoner populations take certain classes. He wanted to eliminate commoners and replace them with serfs. Something he might be able to do without anyone else's consent when he becomes king, simply by ordering it to be so. Kings could already forcibly change some classes, and changing the law of the land might be enough to enforce it on all citizens who acknowledged him as their king. The serf class was one of the slave classes. You couldn't choose to be a serf, not really, it could only be forced on you. No one would choose it anyway, because like all slave classes it enforced certain rules and behaviors on the class holder, the most noticeable of which was the inability of a serf to leave the land of the noble that ruled them. Serfs would find at the edge of that noble's territory to be an invisible, but impenetrable, wall. Other things that were enforced by the class? Obedience for one, although not as strongly as the slave class did. A serf could be ordered to do things in a general sense, but they had the autonomy to act as they wished so long as they were technically accomplishing the assigned task, while a slave had to follow orders to the letter. Although this difference was mostly academic, because from the perspective of a serf it wouldn't feel much different. I wrote a letter to the prince that night, unable to understand how the kind prince I used to know had changed into the kind of man who would enslave every free person in what would be his kingdom. It wouldn't even be very efficient. Slave classes were well known for giving mostly survival-related skills, their low stat growth outside of endurance, and their tendency to stunt the growth of other classes. I pointed as much out in my letter, not content to merely appeal to his conscience. If his kindness wasn't a lie and it hadn't changed, that would mean that he had made this proposal despite his feelings, and so appealing to his feelings alone would likely get me nowhere. I sent the letter and spent the next 2 weeks avidly following any gossip about the prince and anxiously waiting for his reply, hoping that he would send one and hoping that he would change his mind. 2 weeks later, I got my reply and my hopes were dashed. Moreover, I was shocked by what I read. Dear Mrs. Joshua, it was good to hear from you again, despite the content of your letter. I understand why overhearing my proposal second or third hand would alarm you, yet you are the basis for my proposal in the first place. You once told me that the difference between the average commoner and yourself was nothing but the motivation to be better. This stuck in my mind and I found myself agreeing. What separates the successful from the pathetic? Effort. Even the lowliest servant can seek to improve themselves and improve their lives either by evolving their class or by raising their skills or even just finding ways to improve their efficacy and efficiency in their day-to-day life. Yet how many do even the smallest amount of this? I have access to the numbers and classes of the people in fracas, as best as we are able to count anyway. Relatively few people evolve their classes before they die, and yet many are able to evolve their class without much effort. They could do better, but they won't do better. You taught me that willpower is not willpower. The stat might make your willpower stronger and make hard choices easier, but if you are willing to hurt to accomplish a goal you can push past even a low will stat. If you stake your identity on a concept, that concept can be stronger than your stat shows. Were I someone else, I would do naught but praise you, but I will be a king. As a king, I have to do what I think is best for my kingdom, and I believe that serfdom is the best choice for now. It is a hard choice and a choice that I likely won't ever forgive myself for, but the people can do better. They will be better, even if I have to make them better at the point of a sword. Sincerely, yet sadly, Prince Luoz. P.S. My great father has adopted another one of my proposals. I remember you were quite a good student, and now the top 3 students that graduate the academy will be granted an honorary noble title if they don't already have one. Study hard, and next time we meet you might be a noble yourself. I understood what the prince was doing. I didn't like it, but I could see why he was doing it. In the proposal he outlined, the serf class would be a stepping stone. An easy way for him to force people to improve themselves, and once they saw the benefits of self-improvement they would not need the serf class anymore. The average level and quality of classes would rise, and the kingdom would prosper from the royal family all the way down to the poorest orphan. It made me uneasy, but Prince Luoz was not wrong that the best choice sometimes hurt. I wrote back, saying that I understood and thanking him for taking the time to reply to me. * Kingdom of Fracas, Royal Academy of Magic, 3 years ago. * And on behalf of the king, long may he reign with wisdom and grace, I grant you, Elma Jashui, an honorary noble title. From now on, you are Elma Devon Jashui. There was applause from the seated crowd as the headmaster presented me with a noble title, even though he said my name wrong. Hopefully that wouldn't be too annoying to correct when I mingled at the party afterwards. You have met the requirements for the class, noble. You have 7 open class slots. You have classes available. Would you like to see them now? I had graduated at the top of my class, and gained a new class for it. Unfortunately, I was not better than making that pun, but I allowed myself to feel a little giddy as I opened up my menu and took the noble class. Congratulations! You have chosen the class, noble. You have gained the class ability, noble bearing. I immediately felt more comfortable in my formal dress, and it was easier for me to keep my back straight. I don't know what the ability did in its entirety, but I would read it later. Staring into space right now would be all taken. It was important for me to make a good impression today. It had been 9 months since Prince Luo's proposal was accepted, and many commoners had their classes changed to serf. Near as I could tell, things were not going according to plan. The temples had come out hard against the proposal, but had not outright forbidden it, and the nobility was already starting to exploit the power they had over their people. While I would be employed by the countess, who had not followed the king's decree and allowed her commoners to remain commoners instead of becoming serfs, I would have time to travel around the country. I would help the prince by keeping an eye on some of the more troublesome nobles. I didn't like this, but I would help to make it work. However, it wasn't going to be easy. Kivas wasn't a good man, but he had become a better man than he was at first. He had the face of a gleeful and sadistic bully as a kid, and he still showed a lot of that swagger, but it covered exhaustion, desperation, and resignation, and he was happy to see someone else escape that life. The nobles I had for classmates had gone from arrogant to cold and calculating at best, and at worst had gone from arrogant to more arrogant. Most had been going for a class like Mage Lord, but since the advent of serfdom in Fracas, a couple of inheriting lords had gained the class Magister. While the Magister class wasn't inherently linked with slavery classes, but it was heavily associated with them. Slavery was sinking into the noble culture faster than anyone expected. * Kingdom of Fracas, Royal Palace, 2 years ago. I had an audience with His Highness, Prince Luoz. It had been nearly 2 years since the king had accepted his proposal, and I was here to beg the prince to reconsider. His plan had failed in just about every way it could have. After witnessing the depravity that people could sink to if given the chance, I realized the horrible naivety that underlay this plan. It presumed that the nobility were good people and that they were able to help and guide the people under them. Unfortunately, The amount of good nobles, lords, and ladies was far less than what I might have hoped, and having such power over their serfs corrupted even decent nobles quickly. The good ones? Well, most of them refused to allow their populations become serfs, and the few who actually tried to follow the prince's plan were mostly incompetent and unable to improve their people meaningfully. It was only a fraction of a fraction of a fraction that managed to succeed, and they represented too small of a population for it to matter. It wasn't worth it. Ah, Mrs. Joshua, the prince entered the room with a smile on his face, followed by a young servant girl. It is wonderful to see you again. You honor me, Your Highness. I stood up and smoothly knelt. I am overjoyed that you were willing to see someone like me. He laughed. You don't need to kneel, you're a noble now, a bow will suffice. Your Highness, I kneel out of respect to the crown and the royal family, I answered, although I smiled back. Despite my honorary title, I am still a commoner. It is right that I should show respect to royalty. And I accept your respect. The prince walked up to me and offered his hand. Yet, here in private I would have my former classmate stand. Did I take his hand because of my feelings for him? If I was honest with myself, yes. In a more formal setting I probably should have remained on my knees until he asked again and then stand by myself. I was almost never around men of my station, so I had ended up continuing to cling to old feelings even years later. Thank you, my prince, you were too kind, I said, attempting to keep my voice steady despite my fast-beating heart. Yet I fear I must rely on your kindness once again, because I am here to beg you to convince His Majesty to rescind the serf decree. I am sorry to say it, but it hasn't worked. Yes, I know. His voice hardened and he glared at his servant, who flinched away from his gaze. You are special, it seems. Most of the peasantry are useless fools, unable to advance even with guidance and resources. Please, Your Highness, the servant girl whispered. I'm sorry. Prince Loses turned on his heel and strode over to the servant, interrupting her by slapping her across the face hard. As an adult man hitting a young girl, he knocked her to the ground. Sorry. You stupid fool. I was shocked to see the prince, a paragon of virtue in my mind, proceed to kick the servant who curled into a ball to protect her head. Even in this, you fail. You could have leveled your etiquette simply by standing there and doing nothing, yet you can't even do that. Your Highness, please, stop. I spoke up as soon as I gained control of myself again. There is no need to beat her. I am sure she can be guided without resorting to that. Ha! This is just another in a recent string of failures for her. He kicked her one last time before turning back to me and smiling again. No matter what I do, I cannot motivate her. Even with her family or purity on the line, she still messes up again and again. And she is hardly the first one I have tried with. No, the lowborn are just that. A few special people like yourself might arise on occasion, but most are just scum. I was horrified and terrified. What had happened to the prince? How could he be so kind to me, but so cruel to another? And from what he said. Forgive me, Your Highness, I had to ask, but when you said purity, did you mean? The answer horrified me, and I did something I never thought I would. I took hold of the blessing I gave him all those years ago and twisted it. Under normal circumstances, I would never be able to do this. The prince also had a mage class and wore protections against hostile magic, but he had accepted my blessing years ago and I had blessed him for his kindness. Things like that mattered to magic like this. Ilma? Prince Loses could see the mana flowing, but since it was partially inside of him it was hard for him to see it perfectly. He would have to rely purely on his manasence to understand, but it was too late. What are you doing? My prince, not even 20 minutes ago, I thought I loved you, I answered with tears in my eyes. But now I know that what I loved was just a figment of my imagination, and I have seen who you truly are. Prince Loses, once I blessed you for your kindness, and now I curse you for your cruelty. Should you raise a hand against another against save in self-defense, you will suffer for it. You have met the requirements for the advanced class, Which? You have 6 open class slots. You have classes available, would you like to see them now? He merely snorted, saying, "It is impossible to curse me through my protections. Here, watch." He turned and kicked the young girl, only to start screaming when fire leapt from the candles and set him on fire. Guards rushed in as the prince thrashed and shouted and clawed at his burning clothes and hair. "You have met the requirements for the class, Firemage. You have 6 open class slots. You have classes available, would you like to see them now?" The fire was put out soon. The royal guard did not lack for magic users nor healers. Then, the prince's hate-filled glare settled on me. She did this. He told them, "Arrest her and have her executed." Now, the royal guard drew their weapons and began to approach me, but I stood there feeling a strong sense of calm settle on me. I stood by what I had done. I demand a trial by LA and Scully's. I invoked one of the God-given rights available to all sapients by the gods themselves. Justice is not law, nor is law justice, and I would put my case before Skillus for his judgment. The prince was still yelling for my arrest and execution, but the royal guard hesitated. I had cursed the prince, but ignoring the edicts of the gods would bring down a curse that made mine look quaint. LA would know, because LA always knows, and she would tell her brother and they would feel the wrath of the gods. They arrested me, but they called for the servants of the gods. I was not taken to the dungeon, but instead was dragged before the king himself. I knelt without having to be forced, because the king was not his son. I was unsure if the king was good or evil, so I could only offer respect to the institution. I was better than the people who could not tell the difference between the throne and the person on it. Given the gravity of the situation, it was unsurprising that we did not have to wait long for the priestesses to arrive. The royal guard offered no explanation, because none was needed. The priestess of LA looked at me and knew, looking at me for a few seconds before whispering in the ear of the other priestess. "You have asked for, and will now receive judgment from the gods themselves, as is your ancient right." The priestess of Skillus spoke, "Know, that by the grace of LA, that Skillus can weigh not just this moment, but the entirety of your life, past, present, and future." Now that was strange. Normally, the priestesses would only rule on what they were called for. It strained the priestesses to channel that much of their god's power, and it was rare that they would bother to do so. Skillus has, in his wisdom, decided not to judge you, the priestess continued, to the shocked mutters of everyone in the room. As such, our role here is done. Skillus had decided not to judge me. If it was rare for the gods to weigh a person's entire life, it was even more rare for Skillus to decide not to make a judgment at all. When Skillus refused to judge, it was a declaration that someone had done the wrong thing for the right reason. A thief stealing a loaf of bread from a merchant for a starving friend would be judged by Scully's, although mercy would almost certainly interfere there. However, a thief who saw that merchant steal his location from another by using thugs to intimidate them and decided to steal from the merchant after seeing that would often have Skillus refuse to judge. How do you steal from a thief? How dare someone declare justice in hanging a thief who stole from another thief? How dare the powerful shield themselves in law and call their acts just? Yet, acts of vengeance and vigilantism are not justice either. Even if the system is corrupt, a criminal is still a criminal. Wrong is still wrong, and justice is always justice. Absolute beyond human Kentucky, and in that confusing mass of possibilities and potentials, there is a thin line that divides right and wrong. Today, I walked that line. Ilma, the priestess, spoke quietly to me as the people around erupted in protest and argument. "Would you like to come with us? I doubt you will be welcome here anymore." I nodded, still stunned by what had happened, and was guided out of the palace and to the temple. The gods themselves had weighed my entire life and decided that I was neither good nor bad. I wasn't sure how to react to that. There was no point in denying it. Truth and justice had made the declarations. If they say it is so, then it is so. I was lost in my thoughts, simply sitting in the temple, when an acolyte approached me with a smile. "Hello there, Ilma, my God asked that I find you." He held his hand out and I shook it, somewhat numbly. "Ah, how rude of me, I forgot to introduce myself. I am Earl Kent. Do you have a moment to hear about Lord Euchus, god of ambition?" It was then everything crystallized for me. I didn't need to be good or bad, I would simply just be better. Tobe continued, "Thanks for listening.